This project was incubated during my time here at the Drescher Center as an Inclusion Imperative Fellow. So I owe a great debt to UMBC for giving me the time to actually stop, take a breath, and really think about what this project could be. And today I'm giving you a glimpse of chapter 6 of the book, which details how Black players transformed professional basketball both on and off the court in the 1970s. And where we're picking up here is at the end of the book, where we're looking at a concerted white backlash against the growing dominance of Black players in the league and how they transformed not just the style of play, but also the power dynamics between the team owners and the players. All right, so I'm going to start. There we go. This was my thank you slide. Forgot to show that. And this is the cover of the book, the illustrious cover. I hadn't thought of T-shirts, but now I might have to. All right, so I'm going to start with this concept of the NBA's dark ages. On the night of December 9th, 1977, the Los Angeles Lakers African-American power forward, Kermit Washington, became the face of the National Basketball Association's, or NBA's, chaotic descent into its so-called dark ages. As David Stern, who was then the NBA's outside counsel, recalled, quote, "We were looked upon as a league that was too Black, too violent, and too drug-involved during the late 70s, end quote. In front of a packed crowd at the Los Angeles Forum, the known enforcer had punched white Houston Rockets star Rudy Tomjanovich in the face with enough force to knock him out, resulting in serious injuries to his head and face. NBA Commissioner Larry O'Brien quickly slapped Washington with a $10,000 fine, which was equivalent to about almost $50,000 in today's dollars. And he also gave him a 60-day suspension without pay, which one journalist at the time estimated at a $53,560 loss, equivalent to around almost $255,000 in today's dollars. And this was the harshest punishment for fighting that had ever been given in a professional sport to date. Washington became a scapegoat in the league's get tough approach to restoring order, one that seemed to parallel the efforts to punish Black crime and quell chaos in America's deteriorating cities. Although this was a time when most NBA games were not televised nationally, the footage of Washington's punch played repeatedly on broadcast television, fueling public discussions among mostly white male commentators and the league's majority white fans about the inherent violence, ungovernability, and delinquency of Black players and Black men, more broadly speaking. As Stern later recollected, quote, "This was a monumental event when it occurred because it appeared to symbolize everything people were saying about us. And it got so much attention at the time, which only made it more difficult for everyone," end quote. So this talk is not about the punch itself, but about what it meant for different constituencies. So the players, the team owners, the fans, the sports writers, and league officials. And what it meant in the context of racial integration in professional sports and U.S. society in the post-civil rights era. In many respects, the controversy surrounding the punch became a microcosm of ongoing debates about the intersection of race, masculinity, and violence at the height of the so-called urban crisis. As Stern's comments suggest, the 1970s, particularly the late 70s, is popularly understood as the dark ages of the NBA. Now, this label dark refers not only to the blackening of the league, of the professional basketball's workforce, but also to the growing associations of the sport with African American urban violence, crime, and pathology. Historian Matthew Schneider Meyerson notes that this period, quote, has been mostly ignored by lay people as well as scholars, who have generally agreed on a simple narrative that professional basketball in America struggled at the time because it was too black, too drug-infested for a white audience. And I confirmed that in a lot of my research. This was the narrative of the time. And actually, if you look at a lot of treatments of this time, people have uncritically repeated those narratives about basketball in the 1970s. And as a result, it's sort of like this flyover period in NBA history that nobody really has attempted to deconstruct or talk about, especially in relation to race. So through analyzing the public discussion surrounding the infamous punch, we'll deconstruct and critique this declension story of the NBA during what I call the long 70s. And arguably, it also helps to begin to critique broader declension narratives about Black politics in the 1970s, which I think is a field that is gaining a lot of momentum, particularly among historians, as a place that we need to revisit in terms of continuity of activism, in terms of ongoing struggles, right? We often think of the break being 1969 or maybe 1970, and then we sort of pick things up again in the Reagan era. But there was all sorts of activism and a backlash to that activism going on in the 1970s. So professional basketball emerged as a crucial site for public debates over Black politics and culture in the late 20th century United States. During professional basketball's dark ages, African American athletes not only became the demographic majority, so around 75% of the players, whereas in the 1960s, they were still only about 58% of the league's labor force. But these same players also fought for greater compensation and control over their labor, and they changed the character of the game by infusing it with the style and ethics of urban Black street ball. This racialized power struggle over the future of sport played out in the form of numerous crises over not just on-court violence and drug abuse, but also the league's monopoly status and the reserve clause. As NBA executives and team owners tried to figure out how to best manage, market, and then monetize a sport now dominated by Black players. This was seen as a problem back in the 70s. Now we just sort of take for granted that the NBA is both demographically and stylistically a Black league. But at the time, the powers that be in the NBA really were kind of wondering, what's the future of this sport? Rather than a story of decline at the hands of Black players, a close reading of The Punch reveals a league in a pivotal moment of racial and structural transformation and the intense white backlash that accompanied it. And, I did this cursory reading of memoirs and oral histories of the supposed golden age of professional basketball, which people often point to the 1950s and the 1960s as being, when basketball really was true to its roots. And what I found was that a physical style of play, the use of drugs and alcohol, and struggles between players and owners were all a part of the game. So it became very clear to me that a lot of what we were talking about in terms of a dark age was actually a racialized narrative about basketball specifically and about Black culture and politics more generally in the 1970s. The darkening of the NBA happened at the same moment as two significant changes in the industry. Firstly, professional basketball was becoming increasingly corporatized and consolidated. By the late 70s, the NBA had a monopoly on the professional game after its merger with the rival American Basketball League in 1976, which brought in 4 more franchises to make a total of 22. Secondly, the NBA had begun to expand its media reach nationally, moving beyond local radio and newspapers to broadcast television, thanks to a deal with CBS. And this is another thing we often forget about. The NBA is a huge media property now. It's a multinational corporation with multiple streams of revenue. It has global appeal. But back in the 70s, it was still a relatively small sports property in North America, and it didn't have the same kind of cachet as Major League Baseball or the NFL. Amid this consolidation and expansion, Black professional basketball players became increasingly visible symbols of the promises and pitfalls of racial integration. With their relative fame and wealth, they became easy targets within the context of the economic hardships caused by 1970s stagflation and deindustrialization, the white backlash against the supposed excesses of the civil rights Black Power era, and also the anti-Black politics of law and order. So they became a way for folks at large to talk about these larger shifts in society. All right, so the punch. Up until the late 1970s, most NBA fans still heard about their favorite teams through their local sports pages and radio stations, and even taped highlights were somewhat rare and often delayed. As Kermit Washington recalled, quote, "We played in privacy. You'd hit somebody, maybe get fined $250, and that was it." Thus, the flurry of national newspaper reports and the wide dissemination of Washington's punch via broadcast television were actually quite exceptional. Footage of the incident played repeatedly, not just on sports shows, but on news and entertainment programs. Even Saturday Night Live made a skit about it. But all of these worked together to turn Washington into a virtual pariah in the court of public opinion. Right? You can see this in this one quote from Mike Newlin, who was part of the Houston Rockets. He said, "Criminals have no rights, and Kermit Washington is a criminal. I don't know Kermit personally, but some guy broke the law, and he belongs behind bars. If he did to me what he did to Rudy, I'd go out and get the biggest gun possible and shoot him." So this was about much more than just the actual punch. It became wrapped up in all of these discussions of law and order, and what folks imagined was the increasing criminality of particularly Black male youth in quote-unquote inner city neighborhoods. Now, despite all the hype and repetition, the television clip of the punch provides a notably incomplete representation of the fight. Okay, let me just play it for you. Now, keep in mind that this is in slow-mo, so it will only emphasize the punch. So in reality, I mean, there's no disputing that this was a big punch and that, Rudy Tomjanovich sustained incredible damage from this punch. But what I'm more interested in is how it was being read through this lens of Black criminality, which, if you know anything about hockey, there's lots of fights in hockey, but the same kind of discussion was not happening in hockey. All right. So let me just, all right. So that'll be playing on in the background. But what you notice is that the camera only joins the action belatedly at center court, meaning that any reconstruction of what initially provoked the incident relies largely on the memories of those involved and those who witnessed it. In the second half of the game, Washington and the Rockets' white center, Kevin Kunert, had gone up for a rebound. The two ended up in a skirmish under the basket that continued as they moved to center court. Reportedly, Kunert had elbowed and hit Washington, while Washington punched Kunert in response. The Lakers' Black Star center, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, had stepped in to break up the fight, while Tomjanovich had rushed back to center court to the aid of Kunert. Seeing Tomjanovich approaching out of the corner of his eye, Washington had turned around and punched the white guard, landing a solid right hand under Tomjanovich's nose. It was an impulsive action. Tomjanovich was knocked out cold and landed on the back of his head. It took him several minutes to come to, and he was escorted off the court and into an ambulance. At the hospital, X-rays revealed that Tomjanovich had a broken nose, fractured skull, cracked eye socket, and leaking spinal fluid. And he ended up in the intensive care unit. His season was essentially over. Again, big punch, right? Certainly the physical consequences of the punch were dire. But had Washington committed a crime? A savage assault? Was the NBA becoming a den of black delinquency? Now, much to the chagrin of league officials and team owners trying to expand their ratings and market share in the late 70s, the punch confirmed popular perceptions of the NBA as a violent and out-of-control black league. It came on the heels of a period of ramped-up speculation and expansion as the league competed with the rival American Basketball Association for top player talent and maneuvered to regain its monopoly over the professional game. Taking full advantage of this opening, the players used union organizing, particularly through the black-led National Basketball Players Association, or NBPA, to push for better compensation and fringe benefits. They also made appeals to Congress to block a proposed NBA-ABA merger and filed antitrust lawsuits, most notably Oscar Robertson et al. V. the NBA, which was eventually settled in 1976, which helped to bring an end to the reserve clause that restricted player movement. So for those who don't know about the reserve clause, essentially when a player was drafted by a team, that team owned their contract, right? And they could not move in the same way that players who have free agency now are able to shop their talents to other teams. They were bonded to that team for the entirety of their career unless the team decided to dispense with them or trade them. So many players at the time, Oscar Robertson included, who's sitting here with Dave DeBusschere in front of the Senate committee, really saw this as having echoes of a kind of ownership of black bodies because the NBA was 75% black at this time. As these battles played out on the sports pages, team owners and league officials, with the help of white sports writers and commentators, cast the majority black players as greedy, ungrateful, and undisciplined, and claimed that their exorbitant salary demands were bankrupting franchises and threatening the very future of professional basketball. Having challenged the autocratic power of the league, black players no longer seemed to know their place. Now, this context helps to explain the NBA's unprecedented punishment of Washington in the months that followed. In taking a punitive stance, the NBA essentially reassured white fans that the league was committed to protecting the purity of the game in the face of racial integration, rising player salaries, and increasing commercialization. Now, whether perpetrated by white or black players, an aggressive style of basketball was typical of the league at the time. However, in the late 1970s, on-court violence became increasingly encoded as a black problem. Even before Washington's punch, Fisticuffs during games had become a point of concern for league officials and team owners. During the first season of the newly merged NBA in 1976-1977, there were 41 fights that led to the ejection of at least one player. Now, one of the most notorious incidents happened in the fourth quarter of Game 2 of the 1977 NBA Finals in front of a packed arena of 40 million television viewers. It was a fight between two black players, the Philadelphia 76ers center, Darryl Dawkins, and Portland Trail Blazers power forward, Maurice Lucas, which then spun out into a brawl. They squared off at midcourt after the 6'11", 260-pound Dawkins had tried to punch Lucas's white teammate, forward Bob Gross. Both of their teams came off the bench to pull them apart, while fans started pushing toward the court. Even the coaches scrapped with some of the spectators, so it was like kind of a melee at this game. However, in the end, the referees ejected only Dawkins and Lucas from the game, and NBA Commissioner Larry O'Brien later fined each of the players $2,500. Now, fans likely saw this stiff punishment as necessary, if not fair. By the time of the fight, Dawkins, see him over there on your left, Dawkins was already known for being raw, rough, and immature in part because he was the first high school player drafted directly into the NBA in 1975. Spencer Haywood v. the NBA, which was a court case in 1971, had actually struck down the league rule that a team could not draft a player until 4 years after his high school graduation. And that elicited all sorts of anti-Black responses as well about the fact that these raw, untutored, largely Black players would be flowing into the league. And somebody like Dawkins came to embody that. Highly sought after because of his talent and size, his first contract at the tender age of 18 years old was worth a reported $1 million. Curry Kirkpatrick of Sports Illustrated mockingly portrayed Dawkins, quote, the 20-year-old man-child as a savage animal roaming unchained, whose only job was to get the colors on the uniforms right and take names and blast bodies. So you can see all of the rhetoric. This is 1977. I was alive at that time, so it's not that far off. But, a lot of the reporting at that time was steeped in narratives of Black savagery. Meanwhile, this scuffle also helped to seal Lucas's notoriety as a pugnacious player nicknamed the Enforcer. It also did not help that fans and commentators were envisioning this final series as a contest between white ball and black ball. So white ball as embodied by Bill Walton and the Trailblazers, and blackness as embodied by Dawkins, Julius Erving, also known as Dr. J, and the Philadelphia 76ers. Right? And they even continued this into the metaphors used to describe this series. So they said that it pit Blazer calculation versus 76er creativity, and Portland discipline versus Philly anarchy. As Kirkpatrick noted, the 76ers Black Stars had a reputation for being, quote, wealthy, spoiled, egocentric, selfish monsters, end quote. He described their practices as chaotic, with players sneaking cigarettes, playing teammates' children, reading newspapers, and generally horsing around. Kirkpatrick's description of the 76ers was hardly unique, since sports writers at the time tended to characterize Black players as childish, lazy, and overpaid. So given this context, it's hardly surprising that the white sports media saw the fight through the lens of racialized images of urban violence and blackmail pathology. Then CBS play-by-play commentator Brent Musburger had feared that a, quote, full-scale riot was going to break out. Okay, so again, taking up these images of the so-called urban crisis. Of course, there had been Black uprisings in cities across the country from the mid-1960s forward. Musburger later recounted, quote, "This wasn't just another fight in another NBA game. This was two big, strong men who were really angry, taking swings at one another, and no one could stop them. Plus, it was the finals. It was primetime national TV. It could not have made Larry O'Brien happy to see this happening in the middle of his showcase." Right? So we got to remember that this 1977 finals was the first finals of the newly merged NBA. And so a spectacle of violence, so crashing the image of a new and shiny NBA, was just something that was a problem, a public relations nightmare for a league that was trying to connect and grow its majority white fan base. Concerned about the league's image, Commissioner O'Brien began calling for a crackdown on fighting during games. So in the summer of 1977, O'Brien formed an anti-violence committee to find solutions to the crisis. You always form committees, right? That's always the first thing. Let's study this. Let's figure this out. And of course, O'Brien had been a Democratic political operative in his years leading up to becoming NBA commissioner, so it's not surprising that he kind of held his own little Kerner commission for the NBA. Now, to his credit, O'Brien had tried his best to walk the line between appeasing team officials, placating NBA fans, and seeking input from the players. Consequently, the committee was fairly representative of the league's racial makeup and its various constituency. However, he also asked for and received powers from team owners to levy greater suspensions and fines for fighting, and that power was his alone. Okay? Under the old rules, the commissioner could fine a player a maximum of $500 and suspend him for up to 5 days without pay for fighting. So that, again, throws the punishment of Washington into relief in terms of what had happened before and what had started to happen in the 1970s with this ramping up of a punishment or punitive approach. Under the new rules, the commissioner could fine a player up to $10,000 and suspend him indefinitely. As David Stern, then the league's outside counsel, recalled, quote, "The message had to be sent to the players that what had gone on before was no longer tolerable. We needed to stop it before it got worse," end quote. Not only did they toughen punishments, but they concentrated the power to punish without due process in the hands of a commissioner appointed by and beholden to the team owners. Both troubling precedents in the eyes of the NBPA, which was the union at that time. Now, the NBA was uniquely severe in its punishment of fighting. At the time, the maximum fine for fighting that Major League Baseball and the National Hockey League could impose on a player remained $500. Because of the NBA's overwhelming blackness, however, front office executives, team owners, and fans alike saw player violence as a real threat to the sport and the league. Would the NBA become nothing more than a glorified black streetball league? If so, they worried that its popularity and profitability would suffer. In contrast, violence during NHL games had a different significance for the league's white spectators. Walter Menninger, he was a psychiatrist. He was also the former member of President Lyndon Johnson's National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence in 1968, tried to explain the appeal of fighting in hockey. Now, this is a direct quote from him. "Many of the silent majority who feel frustrated, angry, and helpless today can readily identify with the beleaguered, assaulted hero of the war on ice. They experience a vicarious satisfaction from the open aggression and mayhem on the ice," end quote. Completely different narrative of violence in the context of a white league, right, that didn't have these kinds of racial associations with urban Black violence, and particularly young Black men, and calls to get tough on crime. However, on-court violence involving Black professional players simply could not hold the same meanings in the social and political context of the 1970s. Although aggressive players in the NBA were called enforcers, of course, with all of the criminal connotations that go along with that term, in hockey, they were sometimes called policemen. Violence among white hockey players could somehow represent law and order, but among African American ball players, it came to symbolize the growing ungovernability of Black communities and the need for greater discipline and punishment in the post-civil rights era. Now, despite the NBA's best efforts to crack down on fighting, on October 18th, the opening night of the 1977-78 season, the Los Angeles Lakers star Black center Kareem Abdul-Jabbar exchanged blows with the Milwaukee Bucks white rookie center Kent Benson. Benson suffered a mild concussion and a black and bloodied eye. Seen by many as basketball's big Black villain, Jabbar was hardly an uncontroversial figure at the time. As historian Aram Goudsouzian argues, quote, "To many sports fans, Jabbar was a Black giant who ruled his sport, looked serious and bored, punched white players who inflamed his temper, acted rude to reporters and fans, and cashed fat paychecks." In response to the fight, Commissioner O'Brien released a statement. He said, "Conduct of this nature will not be tolerated and will be punished accordingly. Every player in the NBA is on notice that I oppose fighting during games, no matter the provocation. I will use all the powers of my office to prevent violence within the NBA." End quote. Now, even though O'Brien himself acknowledged that Benson had instigated the fight by elbowing Jabbar in the stomach, he still maintained, quote, "Unfortunately, the violation took place far from the ball and game action, and therefore escaped detection by the referees. Whether or not Jabbar was fouled, however, there is no excuse for a premeditated punch from the side." End quote. Now, I did find in the O'Brien papers that Jabbar had actually requested a meeting with him and marched into his office and said, "This is ridiculous," because as somebody who was a center at that time, he was constantly getting, elbowed and bumped on the floor, and he felt like nobody was getting called for fouling him. And he left in a huff. O'Brien said, "Look, I can't do anything about this." And he said, "Well, I'm going to just protect myself and do what I have to do." So this was certainly not something that he was taking lying down, and he did not agree with the way that O'Brien was, making this argument about violence never being justified, even if, the person instigated it beforehand. Now, Commissioner O'Brien made use of the new rules governing fighting and fined the Black center $5,000, the largest amount in the league's history to date. Now, Jabbar actually broke his hand in this fight, and he was out for 6 weeks, so O'Brien chose not to slap him with a suspension. So all of this was going on, and of course, Sports Illustrated decided, let's throw some more, fuel onto the fire. And it published a special issue on NBA enforcers a few months after, with none other than Maurice Lucas gracing the cover. Of the 6 players featured, Lucas, Bob Lanier, Calvin Murphy, Kermit Washington, Daryl Dawkins, and Dennis Autry, only Autry was white. Although the magazine's visual imagery was rife with anti-Black stereotypes, white sports writer John Papanek presented a surprisingly nuanced take on the league's top enforcers. He claimed that bench-clearing brawls were actually not commonplace in the league, and that enforcers rarely had to fight. He said, sometimes a glance is all it takes. Sometimes a word or two, sometimes an elbow or an extra hard pick. Coaches themselves admitted that their teams relied on the presence of enforcers in order to protect their marquee players. And Papanek himself also argued that the refinement of the professional game over the past few decades meant that enforcers were actually now also highly skilled finesse players, that they weren't just hatchet men like the guys from the 50s and 60s. And, you know, Papanek acknowledged there were tons of fights in the earlier period. And yet the typical punishments of the era were much more lenient, ranging from ejection from the game to a small fine. So there's something new going on here. And we can see it in the pictorial that went along with this article. Photographer Harry Benson's accompanying portfolio of the NBA's most wanted enforcers told a much different story, as it played on popular stereotypes or associations between Black men, anger, physicality, violence, and criminality. So on your left, shot from below to accentuate his height, Lucas's full-page photo referenced urban violence and decay. He stands defiantly, arms crossed, chin up, and looking down at the camera. Garbed in patchwork denim, Lucas's body fills the narrow littered space between two decaying buildings. On the opposite page, the portrait of veteran Detroit Piston Bob Lanier evoked two Black male archetypes, the jungle savage and the urban pimp, holding a basketball while wearing a black fedora at a rakish angle and cream-colored trench with a raised collar. Lanier stares intently into the camera. He stands in front of two caged tigers in what appears to be an abandoned industrial space. The next three photos show the intimidating physical power of Calvin Murphy and Kermit Washington, shown both from the front and back. The Houston Rockets' 5'9" Murphy grimaces as he flexes his chiseled upper body. Okay, we can see the continuation of the pictorial. Beside Murphy, a shirtless Washington looks back over his muscular shoulder, glaring at the camera. And finally, Daryl Dawkins' portrait epitomizes the archetypal angry Black inner city youth. In a full-page close-up, he sports his Sixers jersey, his signature gold jewelry, and a sullen expression. Given the pictorial's overarching visual narrative of threatening Black masculinity, the photo of Phoenix Suns white center Dennis Autry seems entirely out of place. Wearing a Phoenix tank top, he is submerged in shallow water, his eyes nearly closed, and his face and body obscured by shadows and refracted light. Now, ironically, Washington had hesitated to participate in this pictorial, but he eventually agreed to do it because the Lakers told him he should do it. He had told the Washington Post, quote, "The Lakers pay my salary, so I did what they said, but I know people will get the wrong impression. I'm not like that at all," end quote. And during the photo shoot, Washington had at first, he refused to give like a mean look, but Benson said, come on, put something behind it. And of course, that was the photo that eventually showed up in the pictorial. Now, Washington challenged his violent reputation in describing his role as the Lakers' enforcer. He told Papanek, "I'm not a policeman. I'm not a fighter. I'm just trying to make a living for myself and my family. If I think someone is going to be taking food off my table away from my family, I get mean. You have to establish yourself in this league. They will push you around if you can be pushed around," end quote. He took on his role as a solid but not yet star forward who was trying to maintain his position and ensure his livelihood in an increasingly skilled and competitive league. Washington explained, quote, "Some of us don't have the talent of the Dr. J's and the Kareem Abdul-Jabbars, so we have to do our jobs the best way we can. I'm just an aggressive guy trying to survive." So he may not have had the skill of Abdul-Jabbar, but he understood that it was his job to protect the Lakers' marquee player. Now, Washington actually went to American University. He was the archetypal safe Black man during his college play. He was a star athlete. He was well-liked on campus. He was even an academic All-American. So even that reputation that he carried with him into the NBA did not inoculate him from being demonized from this one moment in his career. Now, when Commissioner O'Brien notified Washington of his $10,000 fine and 60-day suspension, unpaid suspension, he had little recourse to challenge the ruling. He was left to essentially fend for himself. He later recalled, quote, "No hearing, no appeal, no grievances. If the Lakers could have dropped me off at the end of the earth, they would have." At the time, Washington had been keenly aware of the fight's racial optics. He said, "Let's be realistic. The NBA was worried about the image of the Black athlete. They thought they were doing what was best for the league, so they were willing to sacrifice me. I understood it. Who was Kermit Washington? Nobody special. In those days, Black athletes didn't have the kind of money that gave us leverage. I knew I was in a lot of trouble, not because what I did was right or wrong, but because of how it was portrayed in the newspapers. I was on the front page everywhere. I was like public enemy number one. They kept making me taller and heavier, so I would look more like a bad guy. I was the enforcer. People threw things at me. They cursed me, and the league didn't care. I knew that." And he recognized that he had become not only a convenient scapegoat in the NBA's crackdown on fighting, but also a violent Black bogeyman of white basketball fans' imaginations. And certainly, the media coverage bore out his own analysis. They called him a savage brute. They used all of these heavily loaded, racially loaded terms to describe Washington, but in comparison, they described both Tomjanovich and the other white player, Kunert, as skinny, mild-mannered, peacemakers, the victims, the blameless victims in this. The unprecedented severity of the NBA's punishment of Washington became a central part of the story. In a piece on the history of punishment in professional sport, Sam Goldaper of the New York Times noted that Washington's ranked among the harshest. Okay? Penalties of similar severity were usually reserved for players who gambled on games or teams or players caught using performance-enhancing drugs. Before Washington, the highest fine ever levied was the one levied against Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Okay, and the fans also supported this approach. One fan from Gardena, California, presumably a Lakers fan, said, "Kermit Washington got what he deserved from NBA Commissioner O'Brien. In fact, he's lucky he wasn't banned for life." Meanwhile, another one from Torrance, California said, "Washington's rationalization of why he did it does not hold water. It was a flagrant crime." So you see, everybody is sort of walking in lockstep, except for the Black press. The Black press tended to offer a much more sympathetic portrait of Washington, and they questioned mainstream interpretations of the event. So, for example, the Black Panther, the official newspaper of the Black Panther Party, called Washington's punishment blatantly racist. In the case of both Washington's and Jabbar's fights, the Black players were the only ones to receive disciplinary action, while their white adversaries were regarded as martyrs. And so for them, The plight of these players mirrored the punitive treatment of Black men in the larger U.S. criminal justice system. Now, one of the other interesting things about this is that there were 2 civil lawsuits also filed against the Lakers' parent company. And this is not to mention also the fact that Kermit Washington himself had to become a virtual hermit in his house. He was getting death threats. He was afraid to open his mail. Obstetrician refused to be his wife's doctor for the birth of their second child. Like this had huge implications for him off the court as well. So Washington's punch then also precipitated these 2 civil lawsuits against California Sports Incorporated. Filed in December 1977, Tomjanovich's suit charged that the Lakers were negligent in failing to control Washington's behavior on the court. In February 1978, his case was transferred to federal court and he sought $2.6 million in damages. That same month, the Rockets also filed a federal lawsuit asking for $1.8 million in damages for Tomjanovich's injury. According to both suits, the Lakers were culpable for damages because they had known of Washington's, quote, violent tendencies and had, quote, failed to take proper measures to control these tendencies. Okay, now certainly they sued the Lakers' parent company because they had deeper pockets than Kermit Washington, and they felt that they could get substantial compensation. But this also fed into paternalistic narratives about the need for white control over young Black professional basketball players. In August 1979, both cases finally went to trial in Houston in front of the same 6-member jury of 5 men and 1 woman. By this time, Washington had been traded again. So he was traded to the Celtics, then he was traded to the San Diego Clippers. Given the high-profile nature of the case and the fact that Washington had already been tried in the court of public opinion, attorneys questioned 41 prospective jurors to get to the final 6. Making things more difficult for the Lakers, U.S. District Court Judge John Singleton ruled that an edited film of the punch put together for Tomjanovich and the Rockets could be admitted as evidence, and it was played repeatedly during the trial. The Lakers had objected on the grounds that the film had been altered to accentuate Washington's punch, but it was allowed in anyways. Now, Washington himself felt violated by this process. He said, quote, "The whole trial was about the Lakers' failure to control me, to train me, to keep me from injuring people. It sounded as if they were describing the behavior of some kind of animal. It was infuriating. I'm not even sure why I was there at all. The whole thing was a sham," end quote. Now, the jury ended up awarding Tomjanovich $3.3 million in damages, $1.8 million in actual damages, and $1.5 million in punitive damages, far exceeding the player's requested $2.6 million. So they actually gave him more money than he had requested. And they even gave $50,000 of those damages to his wife for the loss of aid and companionship during her husband's hospitalization. Now, the fact that the jury awarded Tomjanovich more money than his suit requested was rare. They had added 50% to the $1 million in punitive damages sought by Tomjanovich. And one legal expert at the time said, quote, "It means that the jury is completely turned off by what has occurred. They believe it was an act with malice and disregard for a person's safety. It was a brutal act and an act outside the human element," end quote. Shortly after the verdict, incidentally, the judge revealed to the lawyers that at least 2 of the 6 jurors had asked if Tomjanovich could autograph their copies of the court's legal instructions. So many layers, many layers, right? So Washington, like many young black men of his generation, was presumed criminal. In some respects, these racialized scripts of violence and punishment in professional basketball helped to shape conventional wisdom about the necessity of establishing law and order in African American communities. They also served to legitimize the continued white backlash against efforts at racial integration beyond the court. And the fact that black players insisted on being recognized as men only reinforced the class-infected narratives of white male victimization that fed the rise of conservative politics in the ensuing years. Overall, the story of the punch suggests that we need to interrogate what happened after the supposed triumph of sporting desegregation and the heady days of the revolt of the black athlete. How did the increasing presence of black men in high-profile and highly paid professional sports become a means to talk about race in the post-civil rights era? So my work is part of a growing literature that questions simple, celebratory narratives of the racial history of sport and instead explores sport as a significant site of race-making in the 1970s and beyond. It also points to the enduring continuity of different forms of black activism in the immediate wake of the civil rights Black Power era. All right, so I will finish there, and I'm happy to expand on anything in the Q&A. Thanks. Yes.
I really like over here like this. But my name is Kendall, and first I want to say thank you for your presentation and walking us through this because it's a very complex idea. And this is like just a small part of what it really is. Like a lot of really, there's a lot going on here, and I'd like to ask some questions. But first, I want to know what was your framework for this? Like, what was your method? I've seen it in content analysis, but I didn't want to assume.
Yeah. So the book is actually a trade book, so it's less of an academic book. So I was trying to write it in a narrative style. I didn't necessarily do content analysis in a quantitative sense, but for me to acknowledge a particular racialized discourse, I had to see it multiple times being repeated in multiple places. And when I started to line up all of the sources from whether it was Sports Illustrated to television news to the NBA's own pronouncements to just the visual narratives that were being displayed, all of them together helped to really highlight the fact that race, and particularly anti-Blackness, was still very much a part of the sport, even though we have these sort of celebratory narratives about the desegregation of sport in the post-civil rights era. Sure.
I just wanted to know your take on what, like how you felt about the recent controversy about the WNBA basketball championship. Because I read a little bit about it, but I know there's like so much passion to that. Like you have some controversy, but like, what do you think about that?
I mean, it had so many echoes with what happened in the 70s to Black players. And I suspect that as women's basketball becomes more and more visible on a national stage, that this is going to happen more and more. And that, in fact, part of the reason why we haven't heard as many of these sort of controversial moments is because before not as many people were watching. But now they have the attention of traditional sports media. And what was so interesting to me was the fact that a lot of the folks who were commenting on Angel Reese were white men. And white men coming in defense of Reese coming in defense of Caitlin Clark, as if Angel Reese was some kind of threat to her. And to me, I couldn't help but read that, as, another instance of misogynoir and the masculinization of Black women, right, and the treating of them as not women. But also this dynamic whereby, historically speaking, white men in the context of Jim Crow in particular use their prerogative to protect white women as a justification for anti-Blackness, violent or otherwise. So I couldn't help but immediately be like, oh, yeah. And especially because it was trash talking. Yeah. It was trash talking, which is, part of Black playground ball. So it was calling out a cultural practice that's not steeped in violence. It's actually playful. It's part of, it's part of the game. It's part of the game of Black street ball. And it was being completely misread by, these white sports commentators. Yeah.
Any other questions? Hi. But I was wondering, especially I think this is part when you were talking about the photograph.
Yeah.
I was thinking that sometimes, like in analyzing, like stereotypes and things of the sort, you might you get so engaged in trying to see that, how do you essentially keep yourself from reinforcing certain things that you're looking to point out while trying to analyze?
That's a good question. Yeah.
Picture of, I think, Washington, like the big one on the right at the point. We were talking about it, you had mentioned I think you had mentioned that he was looking a bit like solemn or like menacing, and then your explanation of the fact that he didn't want to do it, that kind of made it more clear as to why he would feel that way.
Right.
But initially, I was just thinking like that's just a certain person.
Right.
And it looked like he was really straight faced and like but in a setting. So how do you keep from enforcing those stereotypes?
It's a thin line, right? It's a careful balance because you don't want to reenact the same process in your work. I mean, for better or for worse, none of those pictures actually appear in the book. So it's just my descriptions of them. But one of the things that I often try to do to counterbalance that is to actually provide either the background information where the person themselves is saying, look, that's actually not the photograph that I was doing. Like, who knows? He might have been smiling in the pictures. I don't know what the other, takes look like. But then also providing and going into, and I don't, this chapter was really much more about what white people were saying about Black basketball players than what Black basketball players were saying about themselves. So much of the other part of the book is really digging into their memoirs, their interviews, their own analyses of racism within the game from their perspective. And so this is one of the odd chapters out where it's mostly about here's all of these stereotypes and the ways that they were used to make commentary about these larger social forces. But I think going back to the perspective of the players themselves and how they were representing themselves in the media is the key to countering that balance, because they recognized all of this too at the time, but felt kind of like they had to perform it because their careers depended on it in part.
Going back to what Kendall asked you, as a scholar who's written a lot of scholarly things, and I remember when you were here, we're trying to decide if this is going to be a right book.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about making that decision?
Yeah.
And then how that process is different than maybe the more scholarly things?
Yeah. I'm glad that you asked. I mean, Really, I think up until the end of my time here, almost the end of my time here, I thought I was going to write an academic, like, crossover book. But then I had a meeting with the woman who was at the time the editor-in-chief at Bold Type Books. She's now at Haymarket Books. And she said, no, this is a trade book. I'll find you an agent and you need to work on a proposal. This book needs to be a trade book. And so I was like, okay. I kind of wanted to try it out and see what the process was like. I think that one of the differences is that there are more cooks in the kitchen when you're a trade writer. So even when you're pitching it in a proposal, and the proposals are quite lengthy, right? You have to put the story forward. The analysis has to be baked into the story. So I think that that's in some ways why the presentation sounded the way it was, where I didn't say, and I am going to analyze this. Here is my main conclusion, because you can't write that way in a trade book. And you have to have a certain level of flexibility, not in terms of, like, nobody told me you can't say this or that's not worthy to be written about. But, they taught me how to move things around and create some more dynamism in the telling of the story. And when, too many quotes is too many quotes, and just put one example in. So I actually really enjoyed that process because I liked having the feedback. If you are somebody who holds your writing like this, you probably wouldn't enjoy that because there's multiple rounds of multiple people pouring over, line editing your manuscript. But it also means that the historiography and the larger scholarly conversations are sort of woven into the narrative, as opposed to sort of that pulling it out and making it obvious for the reader. Because the average, Tomjanovich there, the average reader is not invested in the same kinds of conversations necessarily. Yeah.
No, I was going to mark on that.
And then,
this was great. I'm really interested in the union.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what was the relationship, the dynamic there with like the white players and black players in BPA?
Yeah.
I'm reading a book. I'm going to
Okay.
I'm reading a book, and amazing. And then I was also wondering about like disparities in pay. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what was the terms of what was the union doing, and what's the relationship between the white and black players doing?
That's harder to come across, like the differentials in pay. But what I can say, and what a lot of the players complained about, was that if you were a black player like Oscar Robertson, massive star, but he couldn't even get endorsement deals with local companies, like the car dealership. Come shop and get your car at the Cincinnati blah, blah, blah. He didn't get that kind of extra money on top of his contract. So for him and for a lot of other black players, and of course he was a star, so he was exceptional. The average person, and I can't remember off the top of my head what the league minimum was, but it was a lot less than what the star players were making. But the MBPA had managed to raise the league minimum to a respectable amount in this period. But for black players, they understood that having things like the reserve clause, having things like the 4-year rule, which forced you to spend all 4 years in the NCAA before you could make any money off of your trade, put all of the risk on you without the same potential for financial reward, which is why I think that the union once Black players became a majority in the league and Oscar Robertson took over as the head of the NBPA, he started to run it more like an activist, an activist union, taking things that he learned from watching the civil rights movement and using those organizing strategies to get not just the top players, but the last guy off the bench invested in being a part of the union and to use their collective power against the team owners. What's interesting is that in this case, unlike many of the unions outside of basketball, the white players came along for the ride. They didn't set up their separate union. I mean, of course, there weren't that many players in the NBA, so they realized they would have no leverage if they, created their own segregated union. So they actually came along for the ride. Yeah, well, and many of them were also pretty active in it as well. So if anything, it shows that, in this case, a Black-dominated union could actually raise all ships, right? And having white players also invest in the success of that union was really key to them winning a lot of the concessions that, quite frankly, players in other leagues didn't have in the same time period. Yeah.
And you mentioned in the talk that in today's NBA era is a global spectacle. I'm just curious what it's like to talk about this at this moment when the commercialization of NBA is such a huge global.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like, David Stern is often credited with sort of bringing the NBA out of its morass of the 1970s and riding in like a, super sports administrator and figuring out how to make the NBA profitable. And to some degree, some of that's actually true. He had the foresight to know that in order to compete, he had to create an entertainment property that was more akin to Disney than it was akin to the NFL. And I think that that's one of the reasons why basketball, it's not soccer, right? It's not European football, but it's basketball. It's a relatively young sport, even on the national stage. But somehow it's gotten its tentacles into all sorts of arenas that, folks in the 1970s might not have imagined. Partnerships with important media properties, with manufacturers of sporting goods, shoes, etc. So all of that was just starting to get set up in the late 70s and early 80s. But one of the things that I think the NBA did rather cleverly was they figured out that a certain kind of Blackness, embodied, I think, by Michael Jordan, could be very profitable on the world stage because it was an aestheticized Blackness that could speak to youth culture across borders, but it was depoliticized. Right? So I think that was the genius of the 80s and the 90s and now into the 2000s. But on the other hand, I think now, especially in the moment of Black Lives Matter and the bubble, the league has realized that it's actually marketable to carve out a space with non-white fans and more progressive fans. And so it's sort of taken over that space in the sports marketplace, one that the NFL does not inhabit, right? So in some ways, it has been, I think, co-opted as a way to extend the brand. But the players forced it to be that way in the first place because there's nothing inherently progressive about any multinational corporation, right?
Two questions you can answer.
Sure.
So, did you read John
Yeah.
How was your take and then second question is just about the 2005 NBA dress code.
Oh,
Not
yes.
so much about
Yeah.
activities widely considered racist.
Yeah.
I wonder whether you thought about the impact not only on culture, but also the culture outside the
Yeah.
culture of the country because of the way the players have adopted to it.
Right.
Or positive.
Yeah. So, yeah, I read Feinstein's book. It was super helpful in showing me where to look for sources. But I don't think that he uses race very well as a category of analysis or the intersection of race and masculinity and the labor politics at play. Because for me, I couldn't help but see what went on in 1977 as connected to a longer narrative of the troublesome black ball player who was asking for too much, who was ruining the league. And then this comes along and it becomes an explosion of that conversation again. As far as the dress code, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that came in the wake of the Malice at the Palace, which was another huge brawl. It always happens after a brawl. There's all of these rule changes after brawls. And one of the ways that they, tried to show the fans that they were regaining control over the game was to say, okay, we're going to have a dress code now. And this was during the era of, if you look back to the late 90s into the early 2000s, folks like Allen Iverson and others who wore the, I saw them like in the hallways of the stadium. They would be coming to games wearing their puffer jackets, their baggy jeans, their do-rags, the cornrows, the tats, the gold chains, and all of that, became the target of the 2005 dress code. I think the genius of what the players have done is they've actually sort of turned that into an opportunity to get really dressed up before the games. Now I feel like in often unconventional ways, in ways that, they are becoming sort of fashion icons. I follow them all, follow them on Instagram, like League Fits, if you want a good Instagram account to sort of see they call it the concrete runway when they come into the stadium, and so they've partnered with different fashion designers, up and coming designers, and so they've made it into this whole spectacle, often also a gender bending spectacle, which I found really interesting, like dressing in ways that wouldn't be considered traditionally masculine. So there's a ton of things going on there where they've managed to, in response to what could have seemed like a very draconian and anti-Black rule, turned it into a moment where they turned it into a space of expression, creativity, and experimentation.
Any other questions? Before we go, I just want to say, when you say that you were there, you were a dancer for the Toronto Raptors
Yes.
team. Yeah, so
Yes.
She was there.
Oh yeah, like we would peek around, like especially, I don't know, for those who, were not in their 20s in the late 90s, like Allen Iverson, major heartthrob. And so when Philly came into town, we would, be wanting to see his entry into the arena. But yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much, Theresa, for coming.
Thank you.
And there's a very small section out in the hallway if you want to gather around that and shop. But yeah,
Great, thank you so much.